"You will forgive me, your grace, but I cannot in conscience send a girl out into that," said the housekeeper, and the Duke of Wardley, standing at the tall window of his study with a glass of untouched brandy in his hand, did not trouble himself to turn around. Beyond the glass the storm had swallowed the whole of the park. He could not see the lime avenue, nor the lake, nor even the balustrade of his own terrace 20 feet below. There was only a grey and roaring wall of rain, and now and again a white tear of lightning that lit the drowning world, and then abandoned it to the dark. Somewhere out there the London road had become a river. He had heard the undergroom say so an hour past, that the ford at Merrow Bridge was gone under and the coach from the posting house could go neither forward nor back, and that its passengers had been turned out at the lodge gates like so many wet cats. "Then do not send her out into it," Adrian said. "You did not require my leave to be decent, Mrs. Fenwick. You have never required it before." "No, your grace." A pause, the particular pause of a servant who has more to say and is deciding whether the saying of it is worth her place. "It is only that she is not a servant, and not quite a lady, and I did not like to put her among the guest rooms in the east wing without you knowing, the chimneys there being cold and the beds unaired, and the house so full already with her ladyship your aunt and all her people." He turned then. Mrs. Fenwick stood in the doorway with her hands folded at her apron and her candle throwing a warm and trembling light up the seams of her honest face. She had been housekeeper at Wardley Court since before his father died, since before Adrian himself had been anything but a boy who was afraid of the long gallery, and she was the one soul under his roof who spoke to him as though he were a man and not a monument. "Who is she?" he said. It was not quite a question. He was tired, and the storm had put a heaviness in him, and he wanted this settled so that he might go back to not drinking his brandy in peace. "A Miss Merrow, your grace. Come down from the city to take a post as companion to old Lady Thorncastle at Havering, only she has arrived a day before she was looked for, and the ford being what it is she cannot get on to Havering tonight, if the Lord himself commanded it. The other passengers the innkeepers had space for or friends in the village. She has neither. She's a plain, quiet, well-spoken young woman, your grace, no trouble in her at all, and half drowned. And I have given her tea in my own room, and would put her in the little blue chamber over the kitchen stair where it's warm, if you'll allow it, and she'll be gone by 10 in the morning, and no one the wiser." "Then put her there," Adrian said, "and do not ask me again about a bed for a stranded traveller as though I were the sort of man who would turn her into the rain. I hope I am not yet come to that." He saw in the candlelight the small flicker of something at the corner of Mrs. Fenwick's mouth. It was not quite a smile. It might have been relief, or it might have been the beginning of an opinion she had the sense not to speak. "No, your grace," she said, "you are not come to that." And she curtsied and went, and took the warm light with her, and left him with the storm. He stood a while longer. The brandy had gone flat and warm in his hand, and he set it down. He was 33 years old, and he had been Duke of Wardley for 11 of them, and there were men in 3 counties who would have sworn on their mothers' graves that Adrian Thorne had a stone where his heart should be. He had cultivated the belief. It was cheaper than the alternative. A man who is thought to be cold is left, on the whole, blessedly alone, and Adrian had reasons, buried deep and never spoken, for wishing very much to be left alone. The reasons had names, though he did not let himself use them. His mother, dead when he was 9, of a fever that the doctors could not name and his father could not forgive. His father, who had loved her past all reason and had, when she died, simply put the love away like a knife into a drawer and shut the drawer and never opened it again. Not for his tenants, not for his dogs, not for the small stunned boy who had needed him. And then, later, the other name, the worst one, the one Adrian had been mad enough at 24 to speak aloud in front of God and half of London, Cassandra. Cassandra, who had smiled at him across 100 ballrooms and let him believe himself beloved, and who had, 3 weeks before the wedding, married his own cousin instead, because his cousin had come suddenly into a Scottish fortune and Adrian had only a dukedom that was mortgaged to the rafters. He had learned, that spring, what his father had known, that love was a door you were a fool to open, because everyone who came through it eventually walked out again and took the light with them. So he had shut the door too. He had spent 11 years shutting it, until the shutting was no longer an act, but simply the shape of him, the cold set of his face that made the housemaids scatter and the county mothers despair, and his Aunt Augusta call him, to his face, an iceberg with a coronet. Aunt Augusta was in the house tonight. That was the true burden of the evening, storm or no storm. Lady Augusta Vane had descended upon Wardley Court 4 days ago with her companion, her maid, her 2 horrid little dogs, and a settled purpose that she had not yet declared, but which Adrian could smell the way a man smells rain coming. She wanted him married. She had wanted him married for years, in the general way that all his relations wanted it. But this visit had a particular gleam to it, and Adrian suspected it had a name, and the name was Miss Sophronia Kettering, the daughter of a banking family, £30,000, a laugh like breaking glass, and eyes that had run over the Wardley silver at dinner as though counting it. He went up to bed by the back stair to avoid the drawing-room, where his aunt would be waiting with her cards and her hints, and he thought no more of the stranded companion in the blue chamber over the kitchen. Why should he? She was a plain, quiet young woman who would be gone by 10, and no one the wiser. He could not have said afterward at what hour the house went quiet. He slept badly always, a habit of the guilty and the guarded, and the storm did not help it. Twice he woke to thunder that seemed to come from inside the walls, and once to the sound of a shutter torn loose somewhere, and banging like a cannon until a footman was roused to make it fast. Toward 2 in the morning he gave up sleep as a bad bargain, lit his own candle, and went down through the sleeping house to the library, meaning to read himself stupid over some dull volume of agricultural improvement. The library fire had died to embers. He built it up, more from restlessness than cold, and took down a book he did not want, and did not read it. The storm was easing at last. The thunder had rolled off to the east and left behind only the steady weeping of the rain on the leads. Somewhere a clock struck 3, thin and far. He thought of a great many things he did not wish to think about, which is the particular curse of 3 in the morning, and at length, disgusted with himself, he took up his candle again to go back to bed. His own chamber lay at the head of the great stair, in the old part of the house, a vast cold room with a bed like a stone sarcophagus and hangings of dark blue that his mother had chosen, and that he had never had the heart or the indifference to change. He opened the heavy door quietly, from long habit, and stepped in and stopped. There was someone in his bed. For one long, dreadful, unmoving moment Adrian Thorne, Duke of Wardley, stood in his own doorway with his candle held up and his heart gone entirely still, and stared at the impossible fact of a woman asleep in his bed. She lay above the counterpane, not within it, still fully dressed in a grey travelling gown that had dried stiff and creased, her boots set neatly side by side upon the floor, as though she had meant only to rest her feet a moment. One arm was flung above her head, the other lay across her waist, rising and falling with the deep unhurried breath of a sleep too heavy to be feigned. Her hair had half come down out of its plait and lay in a dark spot across his pillow and her face, turned toward the candlelight, was the face of a young woman worn thin with tiredness and travel, not beautiful in any way the county would have called beautiful, but arresting all the same, a wide clear brow, a soft stubborn mouth, and shadows under her closed eyes like bruises. She looked, he thought stupidly, like someone who had walked to the very end of her strength and simply lain down where she fell. He knew at once who she must be, the stranded companion, Miss Merrow, who had been given, by some catastrophe of a tired housemaid or a misremembered instruction, the wrong chamber entirely, not the little blue room over the kitchen stair, but the great blue room at the head of the great stair, the Duke's own, and had been too exhausted to know or care, and had lain down for a moment, and had fallen off the edge of the world. His first cold, instinctive thought was of the scandal. It rose in him fully formed, the way a swordsman's guard comes up before he has decided to lift it. If she were found here, if a servant came, if his aunt, dear God, if his aunt, who was 3 doors down the gallery and slept the light suspicious sleep of the professionally interfering, if his aunt were to open that door in the morning and find an unknown young woman asleep in the Duke of Wardley's bed, there would be no power in England that could unmake the thing. It would not matter that nothing had happened. It would not matter that he had been sitting in the library like a monk over a book about turnips. The world did not run on what had happened. It ran on what could be said to have happened, and this could be said to have happened in a way that would ruin her past all mending and chain him past all escape. He should wake her at once and get her out, and back to her proper room, and pray the corridors were empty. That was the same thing, the only thing. He crossed the room to do it, and then he stood over her, candle in hand, and he did not do it, because she had made in her sleep a small sound, not a word, only a soft broken breath, half a sob. And her brow had drawn together as though even in that deep, exhausted sleep some grief had reached her. And Adrian Thorne, who had not felt his own heart move for a decade, and had rather prided himself on the fact, felt something in his chest turn over slowly, like a great stone shifting after a long frost. He did not wake her. Instead he stood there like a fool with wax running warm over his fingers, and looked at her, and could not for his life say why he did not simply put his hand to her shoulder and end the danger. Part of it, he told himself afterward, was practical. If he woke her, she would cry out, very probably. A strange young woman roused from dead sleep to find a dark-browed man looming over her by candlelight in a strange bed would have every right to scream the house awake. And a scream at 3 in the morning would bring exactly the audience he most wished to avoid. Better, surely, to withdraw and think. That was what he told himself. It was not the whole of it, and he knew it was not. The whole of it was the sound she had made. That small broken breath, and the way her tired face had folded around some private sorrow even in sleep. He knew that face, not hers. He had never in his life seen her before, but the shape of what was on it. He had worn it himself at 9 years old, in a nursery at the top of this same house, weeping into a pillow because his father had walked past his open door as though the door were shut and the boy behind it were furniture. He knew what it was to be so tired, so wholly at the end of one's strength, that one lay down among strangers and let go, because there was no one anywhere whose business it was to catch you. And here was a young woman who had crossed half of England to be a paid companion to an old lady she had never met, who had been turned out into a storm and taken in by charity and given, by some servant's error, the wrong door, and who had lain down in a duke's bed not out of design. For there was not one calculating line in that sleeping face, but simply because she was too spent to know or care where she fell. An adventuress would not have taken off her boots and set them so neatly. An adventuress would not have wept in her sleep. An adventuress would have lain within the sheets, not upon them, and would have contrived to be discovered. Everything about the still, tired, artless picture of her told him the plain truth, that this was innocence, sheer accident, the collision of a tired girl with a great cold house, and that if he handled it as the world would expect him to handle it, that innocence would be the thing destroyed. He drew back a step and then another, moving as quietly as he had ever moved in his life. He set the candle down upon the tall chest by the door, where its light would not fall across her face. And then Adrian Thorne, Duke of Wardley, did a thing he could not afterward wholly explain. He took the folded travelling cloak that lay across the foot of the bed, her cloak, still faintly damp, smelling of rain and cold wool, and he spread it gently over her, over the arm flung across her waist and the grey-creased gown. Because the room was cold and his mother's chimney had never drawn well, and the girl had goose-flesh on her wrist. And then he took the great winged chair that stood by his own dead hearth, and he turned it toward the door, and he sat down in it in the dark to keep watch until the house should wake, so that if anyone came, it should be he who met them at the door, and not she who was found within. He was perfectly aware, an absurd thing for a duke to do. He was, by any reckoning the world would make, sitting up all night in a hard chair to guard the sleep of a stranger who had blundered into his bed. Had it been told to him of another man, he would have laughed at it, in the dry way he laughed at most things, which was to say without much moving his face. And yet he sat there, and the rain wept itself out upon the leads, and the candle burned low. And now and then the girl stirred and sighed and did not wake, and Adrian, watching the pale oval of her face swim in the grey light of the coming dawn, found that the cold thing in his chest, the shut drawer, the frost of 11 careful years, had a hairline crack running through it that he did not know how to mend. To his own great disquiet, was not entirely sure he wished to. Somewhere near 5, with the storm gone and the first grudging grey light coming up behind the shutters, she woke. He saw it happen. He saw her eyes open and blink, and taken first the unfamiliar canopy above her, and then, slowly, the wrongness of everything, the strange bed, the strange room, the cloak she did not remember drawing over herself, the shape of a man sitting motionless in a chair against the far wall. He watched her go rigid. He watched the sleep drain out of her and pure white terror pour in to take its place, and he saw her draw breath to scream, and he said very low and very quick, and as gently as his rusty voice could manage, "You are quite safe. Do not cry out. Upon my honor, you are safe, and no harm has come to you, and I mean you none. Only for God's sake do not scream, or you will ruin us both." She did not scream. She sat up against the pillows with the cloak clutched to her breast, and her dark hair wild about her white face, and she stared at him across the dim room with eyes enormous and dark, and when she spoke her voice shook, but it did not break. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Where? This is not my room. They gave me a small blue room over a stair, and there was a warming pan, and I only sat down a moment, I was so tired. And then the truth of it arrived in her face. He watched it arrive, the full and dreadful understanding, and her hand went to her mouth. "Oh, God have mercy. Whose room is this?" "Mine," said the Duke of Wardley. She made a small sound, not a scream, only a kind of collapse of breath, and shut her eyes. "I am Wardley," he said. "This is my house. You are Miss Merrow, I think, who was to go on to Havering, and who was stranded by the storm. My housekeeper gave you a bed for the night. You were given, by somebody's honest mistake, the wrong door. That is all that has happened. I give you my word as a gentleman that that is all that has happened. I came up from the library some hours ago and found you here asleep, and I have sat in that chair since, because it seemed to me a very great deal better that I should sit awake in a chair than that you should be found alone, and I did not like to wake you and frighten you in the dark. That is the whole of it. There is nothing in it for you to be afraid of. There is a very great deal in it, I am sorry to say, for us both to be afraid of, but that is a different matter, and we shall come to it, and it is not your fault, and I will not have you look as though it were." She opened her eyes. She looked at him for a long moment, and he let her look, sitting still under her scrutiny as he would not have sat under any others, and he saw her, quick creature, whatever else she was, begin to weigh him, the fact that he had not touched her. The cloak he had spread over her cold arm, the distance he kept, the plain, flat, exhausted honesty of his voice. He saw her decide to believe him. He did not know why it should matter to him that she did, but it did. It mattered absurdly. "You spread my cloak over me," she said. "You had goose flesh," he said. "The chimney does not draw. It has never drawn. My mother chose this room for the view and cursed the chimney for 30 years. He had not meant to say the last of it. It had come out of him unbidden, a small private truth handed to a stranger in the dark, and he did not know why he had done that either. "I am so sorry," Rosalind Merrow said. Her voice was steadier now, and something in it, some plain, direct, unfrightened decency underneath the fright, reached him the way her sleeping face had reached him. "I am more sorry than I can say. I have done you a terrible wrong, sir, your grace, and I did not mean it. I swear before heaven I did not mean it. I was only so tired I could not see straight. I have been 3 days on the road and I have not. It does not signify. I will go. I will go this instant and dress in my own room, and I will be gone at first light, and no one need ever—" "Miss Merrow," he said, "listen to me. It is nearly 5 o'clock. The house will wake within the hour. My aunt, who sleeps 3 doors down this gallery, and who has the hearing of a bat and the disposition of a magistrate, will very likely wake first, because she always does, and because she has come here on purpose to find fault with me. If you are seen leaving this room mine, at this hour in that gown you slept in, then it will not matter one straw that nothing has happened. Do you understand me? In the world we are unlucky enough to live in, it will not matter. What is true and what is believed are 2 different countries, and we are about, I am afraid, to be dragged across the border into the second one." She had gone very white. "Then what," she whispered, "are we to do?" What they were to do, as it turned out, was decided for them, and decided cruelly, before Adrian could so much as rise from his chair to open the door and reconnoitre the gallery. For at that precise moment there came a sharp double knock, and the door opened without waiting for leave. A thing no servant of his would ever have dared, and Lady Augusta Vane swept into the Duke of Wardley's bedchamber in a wrapper of purple silk and a lace cap, holding a branched candlestick, followed at a discreet and appalled distance by her own maid, and worse, by the housekeeper Mrs. Fenwick, who had plainly been intercepted in the gallery and dragged along as a witness. Adrian, his aunt began, in the ringing voice of a woman who has rehearsed her complaint, "I will not be kept waiting until noon while you—" And then she saw the bed. Adrian rose. He rose slowly and with great deliberation, and he placed himself, as far as the room allowed, between the bed and the doorway, and he watched his aunt's face perform, in the space of a single breath, a symphony he would remember to his dying day. The complaint died on her lips. The affront gave way to astonishment. The astonishment curdled into scandalized delight, and the delight, swiftly and cannily masked, resolved into something colder and more purposeful, for Lady Augusta was not, whatever else she was, a slow woman. And Adrian saw her understand in an instant not merely what she was looking at, but what could be made of it. "Well," said Lady Augusta softly. "Well, well, well, aunt," said Adrian, "do not aunt me. Who is this?" "This," said Adrian, and his voice was very level and very cold, the voice that had frozen bolder people than his aunt, "is Miss Merrow, a gentlewoman travelling to a post at Havering, who was stranded by the storm and given shelter by my housekeeper, and who was given, by an error, the wrong room. I found her here asleep some hours ago, having myself been up in the library. I have sat in that chair the whole of the night, as Mrs. Fenwick may confirm from the state of the fire and the candle, precisely so that no impropriety of any kind should occur. Nothing has happened. Nothing whatsoever has happened. You will oblige me by remembering that, and by lowering your voice, and by withdrawing so that this lady may compose herself. Nothing has happened, Lady Augusta repeated, and she smiled, and the smile did not reach her eyes. My dear nephew, how very like a man to imagine that whether anything has happened has the smallest bearing on the case. Mrs. Fenwick, you see this? I do, my lady, said Mrs. Fenwick, in a voice of pure misery, and her eyes met Adrian's across the room with an apology in them so deep and so helpless that he could not be angry with her. Some housemaid's error, some misheard word about a blue room, had done this, and the honest woman could no more mend it now than she could hold back the tide. And you, Purvis, Lady Augusta went on, turning to her own maid, you see it also. A young woman, unmarried, unchaperoned in the Duke of Wardley's bed, at 5 o'clock in the morning, in a gown she has slept in. You both see it. Yes, my lady, said the maid, avid as a magpie. Aunt, said Adrian, and now there was a warning in it that would have stopped a charging horse. But Lady Augusta only looked at him, and he saw her lay her cards down one by one with the serene cruelty of a woman who has just been dealt, by pure chance, the entire game. You mistake me, Adrian, she said. I am not accusing the young person of anything. I am sure she is all innocence. I am sure you are the soul of honour and sat up in that chair like a knight in a story. I believe you entirely. But I am 64 years old, and I have lived in the world, and I promise you that not one soul beyond this door will believe a word of it, nor should they, for it is precisely the tale a guilty man would tell. By noon the servants will know. By tomorrow the village. By the end of the week the county, and by the end of the month every drawing room between here and London. There is a young woman who was found in your bed. That is the fact that will travel, and it will travel with your name and hers welded to it forever. And there is exactly one thing in this world that can save her reputation and yours, and you know as well as I do what it is. The room was very quiet. Somewhere below a servant had begun to rake out a grate. The small ordinary sound came up through the floor like a message from a saner world. You will marry her, said Lady Augusta Vane. Adrian did not answer at once. He was aware, with an odd cold clarity, of several things happening in himself at the same time. He was aware of a black surge of rage at his aunt, who had come to this house to sell him to Miss Sophronia Kettering and her £30,000, and who was now, having stumbled on this ruin, plainly and swiftly recalculating whether a different marriage might not serve her purposes just as well, provided it was a marriage she had engineered and could take the credit of. He was aware of the old shut door in himself, the drawer with the knife in it, screaming that this was the very trap he had spent 11 years learning to avoid, a wedding, an opening of the door through which the light would only later walk out, and he was aware beneath both of those, quietly and immovably, of Rosalind Merrow behind him, of the small broken sound she had made in her sleep, and the neat boots side by side upon the floor, and the goose flesh on her wrist, and of the plain fact that whatever ruin was about to fall was going to fall 100 times more heavily upon her than upon him. He was a duke. A duke may weather almost anything. The world forgives a duke a great deal, and forgets it faster. But a penniless gentlewoman travelling alone to earn her bread as a companion, for such a one, a whisper of this kind was not a scandal. It was a death. No respectable house would take her after it. She would go from being a companion to being nothing, to being worse than nothing, a byword, and she had done nothing at all, but be tied in the wrong room. He heard, behind him, Rosalind rise from the bed. He heard her set her bare feet upon the cold floor and stand, and when she spoke her voice was low and steady and clear, and it did not tremble at all, and every soul in the room turned to hear it. "No," said Rosalind Merrow, "you will not marry me. I beg your pardon, my lady, but you will not." Lady Augusta's brows climbed. "I beg your pardon? His Grace has told you the truth," Rosalind said. "I am sure you can see, if you will only look, that it is the truth. I came here half drowned and out of my senses with tiredness, and I lay down in a bed that a servant showed me or that I stumbled into, I hardly know which, and I fell asleep, and His Grace found me, and, so far from taking any advantage of it, sat up the whole night in a hard chair to protect me. He behaved," and here her voice caught for the first time, "not with fear but with something that was almost anger. He behaved better than any man I have ever known, and now you would punish him for it by shackling him for life to a stranger without a shilling, whom he has never before laid eyes on, and you call that saving his reputation. It would not save it. It would be the ruin of it and of his happiness, and I will not be the instrument of it. I would rather lose my own good name 100 times over. I have very little else, my lady, but I have that. I will not buy my safety at the cost of a good man's whole life. I will pack my box and go, and you may say what you like of me, and I will bear it, and His Grace need never think of me again." There was a silence. Adrian found that he had turned fully around, and was looking at her. At this plain-tied, penniless young woman, standing barefoot on his cold floor with her hair down and her chin up, throwing away, with both hands and open eyes, the one thing that could have saved her, because to take it would have cost him. He had lived 33 years among the great and the grasping, among people who would have sold their own mothers for a fraction of what she was refusing, and he had never in the whole of his life seen anything like it, and the hairline crack in the frost around his heart. The one he had noticed in the dark and hoped to ignore ran suddenly and silently from end to end. "You will not go anywhere," said Adrian, "until you have had breakfast and I have had the chance to think, and I will thank the entire company to stop deciding my life for me in my own bedchamber before 6 o'clock in the morning." He said it in the cold, flat voice that ended arguments, and it ended this one. He had Mrs. Fenwick grateful, he saw, for any orders at all. Conduct Miss Merrow to a proper guest chamber in the east wing, where a fire was to be lit and hot water brought, and where she might dress and be alone. He had his aunt's maid and his aunt's avid interest removed from the scene by the simple expedient of walking out of the room himself and obliging everyone to follow, and he had at the door a single low word with Mrs. Fenwick that he trusted her to carry to the servants' hall like law, that any man or woman under his roof who repeated one word of this night's business beyond these walls would be turned off without a character before nightfall, and that he, the Duke of Wardley, gave his personal word that nothing improper had occurred, and expected to be believed by his own people if by no one else. It would hold among the servants. Mrs. Fenwick's authority and his own would see to that. But his aunt was another matter entirely, and his aunt he could not turn off, and his aunt had witnesses of her own, and his aunt. He understood as he dressed in the grey morning with his valet's careful silence around him, was even now sitting over her chocolate composing in her head the version of events that would best serve Lady Augusta Vane. He did not go down to breakfast. He sent for coffee and drank it standing at the study window where the storm had raged the night before, and where now a washed and shining park lay steaming faintly in the early sun, the Lime Avenue hole again, the lake gone silver, the whole drowned world resurrected. And he made himself think coldly and clearly, as he had trained himself for 11 years to think, about the shape of the trap and the ways out of it. There were, so far as he could see, only 3. The first was to do nothing, to send Miss Merrow on to Havering as planned, deny everything, trust to his rank and Mrs. Fenwick's loyalty, and let the thing blow over. But it would not blow over. His aunt would not let it. Even if she said nothing openly, she would let it be known. In the way of such women, by a raised brow here and a significant silence there, and the tale would grow in the telling the way such tales always did, and it would be Miss Merrow who was destroyed by it. And Lady Thorncastle of Havering would hear it within the week, and no companion arriving under such a cloud would keep her post a day. He would have saved himself and thrown the girl to the wolves. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he could not do it. He had sat all night in a chair precisely so as not to do it, and he was not going to undo his own vigil by daylight cowardice. The second was to buy her off and away, to settle a sum on her, a real sum, enough to keep her respectably and independently somewhere far off where the story would not follow, and let her disappear into it. This was cleaner. It cost him only money, of which he had, since certain hard years of retrenchment, at last enough. But even as he framed it, he heard again her clear low voice saying, "I will not buy my safety at the cost of a good man's whole life," and he knew, with a certainty he could not have defended, that she would refuse his money as flatly as she had refused his hand, and for the same reason. Because to take it would be to accept that she had been bought, and there was a thing in her, some hard, bright, clean thing, that would not be bought at any price. He respected it. He realized, coming to respect a great many things about a woman he had known for 2 hours. The third way out was not a way out at all. It was the door his aunt had flung open and named, "Marry her." He turned the coffee cup slowly in his fingers and made himself look at it, the way one makes oneself look at a wound. He did not want a wife. He had been very clear with himself about that for a long time. It was the one settled certainty of his adult life. A wife meant the open door. The light let in, the whole slow, ruinous business of coming to care whether another human creature stayed or went, and then the going, for they always went, by death or by treachery, his mother by the one and Cassandra by the other. And the drawer with the knife in it shut again and colder than before. He had built his whole life to be a house with no such door in it. And here, on a washed grey morning, chance and a storm and a tired girl had walked one straight through the wall. And yet he stood at the window and found that the thing he kept circling back to was not the trap at all, but the girl standing barefoot on his cold floor throwing away her own salvation because it would cost him his liberty. He had spent 11 years believing that everyone who came near him wanted something: his name, his money, his consequence, the £30,000 worth of counting-house eyes that Miss Kettering had run over his silver. It was the foundation of the whole cold edifice he had built. That love was a lie people told to get what they were really after. And in a single night a stranger had walked into that edifice and, without in the least meaning to, pulled out its foundation stone. For here was a woman who could have had, for the mere accepting of it, everything the others schemed and starved for, and who had looked him in the eye and said no, because taking it would have been unjust to him. She had thought of his happiness before her own survival. No one had done that since his mother died. He was not sure his father had ever done it at all. The cold man at the window set down his cup. He was not a fool, and he did not lie to himself, and so he did not tell himself that he had fallen in love overnight, for he had not, and he distrusted men who claimed to. But he told himself the truth as far as it went, which was this, that he had met, once in his life, a person who was exactly what she appeared to be, whose goodness was not a strategy, and that the world was about to punish her savagely for a crime she had not committed, and that he had it in his sole power to prevent that, at a cost to himself that a braver man than he had lately been would pay without flinching. And he found that he wanted, very much and rather to his own alarm, to be that braver man, just once, just in this. He sent for her at 10 o'clock to the library, and he received her alone with the door pointedly ajar and Mrs. Fenwick within call, so that not even his aunt could make anything of the interview. She came in dressed and composed, her hair pinned up, her grey gown brushed, her face pale but perfectly steady, and she stood just inside the door with her hands folded and waited for him to speak, and there was in her bearing no trace of the schemer his whole experience had taught him to look for, and every trace of a woman braced to be sent away. "Sit down, Miss Merrow," he said. "I would rather stand, your grace, if it is all the same to you. I do not think this will take long, and I would rather have it over. I have packed my box. I am ready to go. I only wished to thank you, before I did, for your great kindness of last night, which I shall not forget as long as I live, and to say again that I am more sorry than I have words for that I have brought this trouble on your house." "You have brought no trouble on my house," said Adrian. "That was not brought by an old woman's malice and a housemaid's mistake, neither of which is any doing of yours. Sit down. I did not ask you here to send you away. I asked you here to make you an offer, and I will thank you to hear the whole of it before you refuse it, as I can see you are already making ready to do." She sat down. She sat on the very edge of the chair, wary as a bird, and looked at him with those dark clear eyes and waited. "Last night," Adrian said, "you refused to marry me, and you gave your reason, and it was a better reason than I have heard given for anything in a very long time. You would not save yourself at my expense. Now hear my answer to it, and do me the justice of believing that I have thought it out coldly, for I am, as you may have gathered, a cold man, and I do not do things I have not thought out." "You are not a cold man," said Rosalind quietly. "A cold man does not spread a stranger's cloak over her because she has gooseflesh. But go on, your grace. I am listening." He let that pass, though it landed somewhere and stayed. "You believe that in marrying you I should be throwing away my happiness and my liberty for the sake of a stranger. I tell you plainly that you are wrong, and here is why. My happiness, Miss Merrow, is not a thing that stands in any danger from this quarter, for the excellent reason that I have not troubled to possess any these 11 years, and a man cannot lose what he does not keep. I had determined, long before you were ever driven to my door, never to marry at all, not you, not anyone. My reasons are my own, and I will not weary you with them, but understand that when you refuse me to spare my heart, you are guarding a house that has stood empty a long time and that I had bolted shut on purpose. There is nothing behind the door for you to be breaking. So let us set your happiness and mine to one side, since mine is not in the case. What remains is a simpler and harder matter. There is going to be a scandal. Cannot stop it. My aunt will see to that, and even if she held her tongue, which she will not, a thing seen by 3 servants and a lady's maid does not stay unspoken. And that scandal will fall upon you, who are innocent, with a violence it will never fall upon me, who am guilty of nothing, but you are guilty of nothing either, and it will not matter. I shall be a duke with a piquant story attached to his name. You shall be a ruined woman with no name at all. Do not tell me you will bear it. I have no doubt that you will bear it with more courage than most, for I have seen your courage this morning, and it is considerable. But bearing a thing and surviving it are not the same. You will not keep the havering post a week. You will not get another. You have told me you have very little in this world. I put it to you that after this you will have nothing, and nothing is a colder bed than mine, Miss Merrow, and there is no cloak to spread over it. There is exactly one arrangement that makes the scandal harmless, and it is the one my odious aunt named for the wrong reasons. If we marry, there is no scandal. There is only a duke who fell so suddenly, and so far for a gentlewoman stranded at his door that he married her out of hand, which is romantic and forgivable, and forgotten within the season. If we marry, no one is ruined and no one is talked of, and you are, instead of nothing, a duchess, which I am told is a warmer thing to be than a byword. I am not offering it to you out of duty, though duty is in it. I am offering it to you because it is the only door that leads anywhere but down. For you, because he paused and made himself say the true thing, which he was not in the habit of doing. Because in one night you have shown me more plain honest goodness than I have met with in 11 years of drawing rooms. And I find I would a very great deal rather share my empty house with that than go on rattling about it alone. It need not be more than you wish it to be. I ask nothing of you that you are not willing to give, and I will give my word on that as I gave it last night, and I have not yet, I think, given you cause to doubt my word. She was silent for a long time. He watched her turn it over, and he saw with a strange, painful clarity that she was not weighing it as any of the drawing-room women would have weighed it. The coronet, the jewels, the precedence, the 30,000 things that gleamed in such an offer. She was weighing something else altogether, something behind his careful cold words, and when she spoke it was to go straight to it. "You said your happiness is not in the case," she said, "but mine would be, would it not? You would be giving me everything and taking a stranger into your house and your name forever, and you tell me it costs you nothing because you had already given up on being happy. Your Grace, that is the saddest thing anyone has ever said to me, and I have heard some sad things. I cannot marry a man to be a convenience to my reputation while his own heart goes on being locked in a drawer. It is too much to take and too little to give. If I marry you, I will not be a lodger in an empty house. I will not be able to help it. I am not made that way. I should want." And here, for the first time, the steady voice failed her, and a flush came up in her pale face, and she looked down at her folded hands. "I should want to open the door, Your Grace. I should not be able to stop myself trying. And you have just told me, very kindly, that the door is bolted, so you see it will not do, even setting scandal aside. I would be signing myself to a lifetime knocking at a door that will not open, and I would rather starve honest than do that. I am sorry. I am so sorry. It is a good offer and a generous one, and I know what it would save me from, and I cannot take it." Adrian Thorne looked at her for a long moment, and then, to his own considerable astonishment, he crossed the room and sat down, not behind his desk where a duke sits, but in the chair beside hers, on the level, near enough that she looked up at him startled, and he said, in a voice he had not used with another living soul since he was 9 years old, "Then let me tell you why the door is bolted, and you may decide whether it is a door you still wish to knock at, knowing what is behind it. My mother died when I was 9. I loved her more than my life, and she was here one Tuesday and gone by the Friday of a fever no one could name, and my father, who had loved past all sense, put his love away that week like a knife in a drawer and never took it out again, not for me, not for anyone, and I grew up in this house being walked past by the one man who ought to have caught me when I fell. And when I was 24, I forgot the lesson, and I loved a woman, and I told the whole of London I loved her, and 3 weeks before the wedding she married my cousin instead, because he came into a Scottish fortune and I had only a mortgaged dukedom. And I decided then that my father had been right. That love is a door you are a fool to open, because everyone who comes through it walks out again and takes the light with them by death or by treachery. And it is better, it is safer, it is cheaper, to bolt the door and be cold and be left alone. That is what is behind the door, Miss Merrow. Not indifference. Cowardice. 11 years of a very well-made, very expensive cowardice. And I have never told a soul any part of it, and I do not know why in God's name I am telling you, except that you told me the truth about myself an hour ago, that I am not a cold man, and I find I cannot let you go on believing you would be knocking at an empty house. It is not empty. It is only barred. And a barred door, Miss Merrow, is not the same as no door at all, and both of us know it, and I think that is why I cannot stop talking, and I have not talked this much in a decade. The library was very quiet. Out in the washed and shining park a blackbird had begun to sing. Rosalind Merrow looked at the Duke of Wardley, and her dark eyes had filled, and she did not look away, and when she spoke her voice was very low. "A barred door," she said, "can be unbarred. It only wants somebody on the other side worth unbarring it for, and time and no rushing. I am not afraid of a barred door, Your Grace. I was afraid of an empty house. Those are different things, as you said yourself, of what is true and what is believed. Yes. If you truly wish it, not for the scandal, but because you would rather share your house with me than rattle in it alone, which is what you said and which I choose to believe, then yes, I will marry you, and I will not knock. I will only sit down on my side of the door, and mend by the fire, and be patient, and wait for you to draw the bolt in your own time, however long that is. I have nowhere I would rather be than on the other side of that door, and I have all the time in the world." And Adrian Thorne, who had not wept since he was 9, felt the sting of it behind his eyes, and did not let it fall, but he took her hand, the first time he had touched her waking, and he held it, and neither of them said anything at all for a while, and it was the least empty the house had been in 11 years. They were married 3 weeks later, quietly, in the small grey church at the edge of the Wardley Park, by special license and before the county could do more than gasp. Adrian had judged the tone of the thing exactly, not a hurried hole-and-corner affair that would feed the whispers, but a wedding just grand enough to say, plainly and publicly, that the Duke of Wardley was proud of his choice and dared anyone to think otherwise. He put Rosalind in a gown of dove-grey silk that Mrs. Fenwick's needlewoman sat up 3 nights to make, and he stood beside her at the altar in the cold spring light with his aunt seating in the front pew, and when he said the words he found, somewhat to his surprise, that he meant more of them than he had planned to. His aunt was, of course, the immediate difficulty. Lady Augusta had wanted a marriage she could take the credit of to a bride of her own choosing, to Miss Sophronia Kettering and her £30,000, whom she had already, Adrian discovered, half promised the thing to in a letter. To find herself instead the aunt of a penniless companion whom she had personally caught in her nephew's bed, and to be given no choice but to smile upon it or be seen to have engineered a scandal for spite, was a humiliation Lady Augusta did not intend to swallow. She swallowed it in public. She smiled at the wedding like a woman biting a lemon and told the county that dear Adrian had simply lost his heart, so romantic, so sudden, and that she had known the child's family, a fiction, for years. But she left Wardley Court within the week with her back very straight and her farewells very cold, and Adrian, who knew her, understood that she had not surrendered but merely withdrawn to regroup, and that the Ketterings, balked of their Duchess, would not love the Wardleys either. He said nothing of this to Rosalind. There would be time enough. What he had not expected, what no arithmetic of his had prepared him for, was what it would be like to live with her. He had married her to save her, and half persuaded himself that he did it out of a kind of stern charity, a debt of honour paid. He had told her the house need not be more than she wished it to be, meaning that he expected it to be very little. He had imagined, in so far as he had let himself imagine anything, courteous arrangement of 2 strangers sharing a very large house, meeting at dinner, being civil, going their ways. He had built, in other words, one more careful cold room to be alone in, and moved a stranger politely into the far end of it, and instead the house began, slowly and then not slowly at all, to warm. It was nothing he could have pointed to at first, it was that she was in it. It was that when he came in wet and short-tempered from a long ride about the flooded lower farms, there was a fire lit in the small parlour, and she was in it with a book or her needle, and she did not chatter at him, but only looked up and smiled and said the fire was hers, and he was welcome to half of it, and somehow the ill temper went out of him like water out of a cracked jug. It was that she had, within a month, learned the name of every servant in the house and something true about each of them, and that Mrs. Fenwick, who had served 3 generations of Thorns, had taken to her with a devotion Adrian had never seen the old woman give to anyone, and that the housemaids no longer scattered when he passed, because the whole house had somehow lost its habit of fear. It was that she found things to laugh at, gently, never at anyone's cost, and that her laugh, low and surprised and rare, did something to his chest each time he provoked it, so that he caught himself, a grown Duke of 33, contriving dry little remarks at dinner for the sole purpose of hearing it. He did not draw the bolt all at once. She had promised she would not knock, and she kept the promise with a delicacy that undid him more than any siege could have. She never asked him where he had been or why his face was closed. She never pried at the barred door. She only sat on her side of it, exactly as she had said she would, mending by the fire, patient, and left it always quietly for him to open. And so, by inches, over that spring and into the summer, he opened it. He began to tell her things. Small things at first, the history of a picture, the reason a certain field had never been drained, the name of the pony he had ridden as a boy. Then larger things. He took her, one still June evening, to the great blue chamber where they had met, and he showed her the window his mother had chosen for its view and the chimney that had never drawn, and he told her about the Tuesday and the Friday and the fever, standing at that window with the low gold light on the park. And Rosalind did not weep or exclaim or say any of the useless things people say. She only came and stood beside him and put her hand into his and looked out at the view his mother had loved and said, after a while, she was right about the window. It is the loveliest thing I ever saw, and somehow that was better than any comfort, because it let his mother be a woman who had loved a view and not merely a wound he carried, and something in him that had been clenched for 24 years let go. He told her about Cassandra one night in the library, roughly, expecting he hardly knew what. Pity, perhaps, which he would have hated. But Rosalind only listened to the whole ugly little history of the Scottish fortune, and the 3 weeks' warning, and at the end of it she was quiet a moment. And then she said, with a dryness he had not known she possessed, "Then she was a fool, your grace, and married the fortune and missed the man, and I am very glad of it, for it left the man for me." And Adrian laughed, actually laughed, aloud. A sound so unfamiliar in that room that a footman in the passage started, and he understood, laughing, that the drawer had come open, that the knife was out and had turned in his hand into something that did not cut, and that he had fallen wholly and hopelessly in love with his own wife, and had perhaps been falling since the night he spread her cloak over her cold wrist. He did not tell her so. Not yet. 11 years of cowardice do not dissolve in a single laugh, and there was still deep in him the old terror, that to say it aloud, to open the door all the way, was to invite the light and therefore the loss. That if he let himself love her wholly he handed the world a knife to gut him with. So he held the last of it back, the plainest and truest word, and told himself he was only being careful and did not see, or would not, that his carefulness was the one thing that could yet spoil everything, and that the world, in the shape of his balked aunt and a jilted heiress, had not finished with the Wardleys, and was even now sharpening a knife of its own. For Lady Augusta had not been idle in her withdrawal, and the year that was beginning to feel to Adrian very like happiness, a word he had struck from his private vocabulary a decade before and now found himself cautiously reinstating, was a year his aunt meant to spoil, and she had a whole season and more to work in, and a jilted heiress for an ally, and a great deal of patience. The slow warming of the house came first, and then the harder business of how the county came to know the new Duchess. And through all of it the daily, unlooked-for lesson by which the cold Duke of Wardley learned to be less cold, and those months were the making of everything that came after, so that when the reckoning did at last arrive it found a very different man than it had reckoned on. The first thing Rosalind did, in the second week of her marriage, was to ask Adrian to show her the estate, not the park and the gardens, which she had already walked, the estate. The farms, the cottages, the mill, the whole living machinery of Wardley that fed and clothed some 300 souls, and that Adrian, to his private shame, had run for 11 years by way of an agent and a ledger and had scarcely set his own boot upon in months. He had let it become an abstraction, a set of figures to be balanced, because to go among his people was to be looked at, and to be looked at was to be known, and he had spent a decade arranging not to be known. He told her dryly that there was nothing in a wet October field worth the ruin of her shoes. "I stood behind a counter for 2 years, your grace," she said. "My shoes have seen worse than a field. Take me to see the people. I should like to know whose bread I am eating." So he took her. He took her expecting to be bored, or worse, to be embarrassed, to have to watch his tenants tug their forelocks in fear of him, as they had learned to do, and to watch his wife recoil from the coldness they all felt in him. Instead, he watched something he had no name for. He watched Rosalind get down from the gig at the first cottage they came to, where old widow Hessel sat in the doorway with hands too knotted to spin, and he watched his wife sit down on the bench beside the old woman, as though she had all the time in the world, and ask her not about her rent or her health, but about the sampler that hung faded on the wall behind her, which the widow had worked as a girl of 12, and he watched the old frightened face light up and go young, telling the tale of it. And he understood that Rosalind had done in 90 seconds what he had failed to do in 11 years, which was to make one of his own people feel seen. It went so at every cottage. She knew from her own 2 hard years exactly the weight of a life lived on very little. She never condescended, never gushed, never promised what could not be given. She noticed things. She noticed that the Turnbull children had no shoes and said nothing of it there. But that evening she had the figure of it before Adrian in the library, not a plea, an account, the way a woman who has kept her own books lays out a case, and within the week there were shoes, arranged so quietly that the Turnbulls never knew whence they came. She noticed that the mill race was silting and that young Peck, the miller's son, had ideas for the mending of it that his own father would not hear, and she got the two of them, Farn's son, to lay it before the Duke, and the thing was done, and the miller's family, who had feared the great house all their lives, came in time to bless it. Adrian watched all this at first with the wary detachment of a man observing a natural phenomenon he does not expect to last. Then he watched it with a slow astonishment, and then, he could not have said the day, he found that he was no longer watching from a distance at all, but was in it beside her, on the bench, in the cottage doorway, and that the tenants who had tugged their forelocks in fear of him were beginning, cautiously, to look him in the eye, and that when they did, they saw, standing beside the Duchess they were coming to love, not the cold monument they had always taken him for, but a tired, proud, lonely man who had simply never known how to come down among them, and who was learning. The fear went out of Wardley that autumn the way frost goes out of the ground in spring, from the edges inward, unremarked until one day it is simply gone, and Adrian, who had built the fear on purpose and lived behind it 11 years, found that he did not miss it, and that a house without fear in it was warmer than any fire. The county was a harder country than the estate, and the winning of it slower, for the estate had only to know Rosalind to love her, but the county had heard of her first, had heard the story before it saw the woman, and the story it had heard was the wrong one, the one that leaked out despite Mrs. Fenwick's vigilance and Adrian's threats, the one that ran, in the cruel shorthand of drawing-rooms, that the Duke of Wardley had been trapped by a nobody who had contrived to be found in his bed. Lady Augusta had seen to the leaking of it before she left, dropping it here and there among her correspondence in the guise of loyal distress, and it had done its work, so that when the young Duchess was first seen abroad, at the Assembly Rooms in the county town in October, she walked into a great cold silence and a hedge of turned shoulders and lorgnettes raised like little guns. Adrian had dreaded that evening more than he had let her see. He knew the county's cruelty. He had used it himself, in his cold years, to keep people off. He knew what a room of well-bred women could do to one of their own who had been marked, and he did not know whether Rosalind, brave as she was in a cottage doorway, could stand up under the massed genteel contempt of 300 of the neighbourhood's best. He had half a mind to refuse the invitation altogether and spare her. It was Rosalind who would not hear of it. "If I hide from them," she said, pinning up her hair before the glass with her own hands, for she had never got the habit of a maid to do it, "then I confess that there is something to hide, and the story wins. If I walk in on your arm with my head up and dance and take my tea and behave as though I have every right to be there, which I have, your grace, for I am your wife and I have wronged no one, then in time they will grow tired of cutting a woman who will not be cut, and they will begin to wonder whether the story was true after all, and the ones with any kindness in them will come round, and the ones with none may go hang. Give me your arm, and do not, I beg you, look as though you were walking me to the scaffold. Look as though you were proud of me. That is all the county needs to see, and it is the only thing that will convince them, and it happens to be true." So Adrian gave her his arm, and did the hardest thing he had done in 11 years, which was to walk into a crowded room he could not control and simply be seen to love his wife. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not know how to be, but he found he could stand very straight beside her, and bend his cold head to hear her low remarks, and let the room see him almost smile at them, and lead her out himself in the first dance, though he had not danced since Cassandra, moving through the old steps with a grim determined grace that made more than one dowager reach thoughtfully for her fan. He could not warm the room by charm, for he had none. But he could stake his whole consequence on her, plainly before them all, and a duke's consequence is a heavy thing to stake, and the county saw it, and began grudgingly to weigh it against the story, and Rosalind did the rest. She was not brilliant and did not try to be. She was something the county was less proof against, which was genuinely kind and quick and quietly unafraid. She thanked the sour Mrs. Pulteney for a compliment Mrs. Pulteney had certainly not paid her, so gracefully that the old cat found herself obliged to pay it after all. She sat down beside the plainest and most overlooked girl in the room, a Miss Delabole with a squint and no partners, and talked to her about books until the girl glowed, and 3 of the county's mothers, watching, revised their opinion of the Duchess on the spot, for nothing recommends a great lady to a mother like kindness to a portionless daughter. By the end of the evening the hedge of turned shoulders had thinned. By the end of the month calls were being returned, and by Christmas the county had performed the whole slow revolution that counties perform, and had decided, as counties always decide once the wind has shifted, that it had liked the young Duchess from the very first, and that the story about the bed had always been a wicked invention of that dreadful Lady Augusta Vane, who, now that one thought of it, had never been quite the thing. Adrian watched it happen with a wonder that did not wear off. He had spent his life believing the world to be a machine for the taking of things, a place where every civility masked a want and every smile a calculation, and that the only safety lay in coldness. And here was his wife disarming that whole hard machine not with a colder weapon, but with the one thing he had thought long ago disproved, plain goodness offered without a strategy, that turned out, against all his bitter arithmetic, to be the strongest force in any room she entered. He did not become a warm man overnight, or ever entirely, and nature is not remade in a season, but he found the cold going out of him as it had gone out of the house, and the estate and the county, from the edges inward, and he found that he did not miss it, and that the man Rosalind was drawing out of him by inches, attentive, dry, capable at last of tenderness, was a man he could bear to be, which was more than he had been able to say of himself for a very long time. If the assembly rooms were the county's proving ground, it was the harvest home that November that sealed the thing past all argument, and Adrian remembered it too, for it was the day he was made to see his own people love him. The harvest home at Wardley was an old custom his father had let fall, and Adrian, in his cold years, had never troubled to revive. The great barn had stood empty at the year's end for a decade, and the tenants had learned not to look for it. It was Rosalind who asked, in October, whether they might not have it again, a supper for all the estate in the barn, with the long tables and the ale and the fiddler, the way the old people still spoke of, and Adrian, who could refuse her nothing and would in any case have refused this only out of the shy dread of being looked at, agreed, and then spent a fortnight quietly dreading it, certain that his people would come because a duke had bid them, and would sit stiff and frightened at his board and be glad to get home. He was wrong, and the wrongness of it undid him. They came in their Sunday best, 300 of them, and they were not stiff, and they were not frightened. They were glad, plainly and openly glad, in a way that had nothing in it of fear and everything in it of a thing he had no name for and slowly understood to be affection. Old widow Hessel was carried down in a cart to sit in the warm, and was given the seat of honour by the Duchess's own hand. The Turnbull children, shod now, ran shrieking under the tables. The miller's clever sons stood up, red to the ears, and made a halting little speech of thanks for the mending of the race, and the mending, he said, and then could not go on, of a great deal else besides, and sat down to a roar of cheering that was not for the mill at all. And when the fiddler struck up, and Adrian, prompted by his wife's hand and his own new courage, led the Duchess out on to the swept barn floor to open the dancing, the whole barn rose to it, not because they must, for no one made them, but because they wished to, and Adrian, turning his laughing wife under the lantern light amid the cheering of 300 people who had once scattered at his shadow, understood at last that he had been given, without ever earning it, the one thing his cold father had died without, to be at the end. Not feared in his own house and among his own people, but loved. He danced that night as he had not danced since he was a boy, badly and gladly, and he stood up with old widow Hessel for one slow turn, so that she might tell her cronies of it to the end of her days, which she did. And he drank the health of the harvest with men, whose names he had learned only that year, and would never again forget. And late, when the lanterns burned low and the little ones were carried home asleep, and the old barn had emptied at last into the frosty dark, he walked back across the park to the great house with his wife on his arm, both of them quiet, and he stopped once on the rise where the whole of Wardley lay spread below them in the starlight, the house and the mill and the scattered cottage lights, every one of them warm now, every one of them safe, and he found he could not speak for a moment. "You did this," he said at last, low. "All of it. The house and the estate and the county and me most of all. I was a cold man with a cold house and cold lands and a cold heart, and you came in out of a storm by mistake, and you have warmed every lost stone of it, from the edges inward, and I do not know how you did it, and I do not deserve it, and I will thank God for that badly drawing chimney every day I live." And Rosalind leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the sleeping warm lights of Wardley and said that he had it wrong, as usual, that she had warmed nothing, that the warmth had been there all along, banked under the ash, waiting. That all she had ever done was believe it was there when he did not, and sit down by the cold hearth of him and wait patient for the wind to change, and that the wind had changed, and that here they were. There was one evening that autumn that Adrian carried with him ever after, and set apart in his mind from all the rest, because it was the evening he first understood, not with his reason but in his very bones, that the change in him was not a truce with his old coldness but the end of it. It came about through a storm. Not so great a storm as the one that had brought her. The country saw few of those, but a wild, wet, blustering night late in October, with the wind worrying at the old house and the rain flung in handfuls against the black windows, and Adrian, working late in the study over some tedious business of a contested boundary, became aware that the sound of it had begun, quite against his will, to trouble him. He could not at first have said why, and then he understood. It was the sound of the night she came near enough. The same roar and weep of it, the same shutters straining, and it had called up in him unbidden the memory of that other night, and with the memory a sudden cold clutch of a fear that had no business existing, the fear that had all been a dream, that he would go up and find the blue chamber empty, that the warmth of the past months was a thing lent and not given and could be taken back by the same weather that had brought it. It was an absurd fear, and he knew it was absurd, and he was a rational man who had spent his life despising such fancies, and yet he found he had risen from his desk and left his work and gone up through the sighing house with a candle quickly, more quickly than the errand warranted, to the great blue chamber, and he had opened the heavy door, quietly from long habit, exactly as he had opened it that first night, and stopped in the doorway, his heart going hard, his candle raised, and there she was. She was not asleep this time. She was sitting up in the warm bed with a shawl about her shoulders and a book in her hands and a bunch of candles beside her, and she looked up when the door opened, unstartled, and smiled at him across the room that had been his mother's and his grief's and was now theirs, and said, mildly, that she had wondered when he would give up on the boundary and come to bed, and that the storm was a fright, was it not? And did he remember, and here her smile deepened, that it was very like the storm that blew her to his door, and had he come up, she asked, teasing him gently, to make sure she had not stolen the silver and run off into it. Adrian stood in the doorway and looked at her, warm and unafraid and entirely real, in the bed where he had once found a drowned, tired stranger, and the absurd cold fear went out of him all at once and left in its place something so large he could scarcely hold it. He did not answer her teasing. He crossed the room and set down the candle and sat on the edge of the bed and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment gravely until her smile faded into a question, and then he said, low, that he had come up because the storm had made him afraid, for one black moment, that she was not real, that he had dreamed her, that he would find the room empty as it had been empty all his life, and that he was ashamed to be a grown man afraid of a dream, but that there it was. And she had a right to know the shape of the man she had married, fears and all, for he was done, he said, with hiding the shape of himself from her. Rosalind did not laugh at him, though he had half expected, and would not have blamed her if she had. She put down her book, and took his hands from her face and held them in her lap, and she said after a while that she thought it was the truest and best thing he had ever told her, better than any pretty speech, because it meant that the door was truly open, that he trusted her now with the frightened part of him, and not only the strong part, and that this, and not the storm, and not the fine bed, and not even the coronet, was the thing she had married him for without knowing it, on the far side of that first cold morning, to be let all the way in, past the guard, into the cold, frightened, lonely rooms of him that no one had ever been allowed into, and to light the fires there one by one, and to stay, and that she was real, she said, and she was not going anywhere, not into any storm nor out of any door, not while she drew breath, and that he might come up and make sure of it as often as he liked, on every wild night for the rest of their lives, and always find her exactly here, and that she rather hoped he would. He believed her. That was the thing that changed, that night, past all undoing. He believed her. Not with the weary provisional half-belief he had doled out to the world for 11 years, holding always one coin back against betrayal, but wholly plainly all the way down, the way a man believes the ground will be there when he sets down his foot. He had thought, once, that to believe in another soul so completely was the act of a fool who had not yet been taught better. He understood now that it was the only thing that had ever been worth doing, and that he had been the fool all along, guarding an empty strongbox with a stone where his heart should be. While the true riches walked past his open door and he pretended the door was shut, he blew out the candle. Outside the storm went on flinging its handfuls of rain against the black glass, and the shutters strained, and the old house sighed and held. But inside the great blue chamber, the chimney his mother had cursed for 30 years, and the miller's son had mended drew warm and clean and steady, and the fire burned low and red, and Adrian Thorne lay a long time in the dark with his arms around his sleeping wife. Listening to the storm he no longer feared, and was for the first time in the whole of his remembered life, entirely and simply happy, and he thought, drifting toward a sleep that came easily now where once it had fought him every night, that if the storm that brought her had been the price of it, he would pay that price and every other over again 1,000 times, and count them all cheap. Such nights are the true wealth of a life, and are seldom marked at the time for what they are, but Adrian marked this one, and kept it, and took it out in memory on many an evening in the long good years that came after, when the house was full of children and warmth and the sound of running feet, and the cold man he once been seemed a stranger he had read of in some grim old book and been glad to close. The winter that the county thawed toward the Duchess was, within the walls of Wardley Court, the happiest Adrian had known since childhood, and the happier for coming so late and so unlooked for. He had believed himself past the age and out of the habit of joy. He discovered that joy is not a habit but a weather, and that had only been waiting, all those cold years, for something to change the wind. It changed in small ways he learned to treasure precisely because he had once thought them lost to him. There was the matter of the mornings. He had breakfasted alone for 11 years, early, in silence, with the newspapers and the accounts, and had thought he preferred it. Now Rosalind came down to breakfast with him, though she was under no obligation to, and though he had told her, stiffly, in the first week, that she need not disturb her rest on his account. And she had only laughed at him and said that she had been up with the lark since she was 9, and was not about to lie abed like a fine lady now merely because she had become one, and that besides she liked the mornings, and him, and did he mean to grudge her both? He had not known how to answer that, so he had not tried. But he found within a fortnight that the mornings had become the pleasantest hour of his day, that he read her the absurd items out of the newspaper on purpose to hear her laugh, and that the silence he had once thought he preferred had in truth been loneliness wearing silence's coat. There was the matter of the library. It had been his fortress, the one room in the house where no one came, and he had guarded its solitude like a wounded animal guarding a den. He found himself that winter inviting her into it, and then, before long, not needing to invite her, for she came as of right with her own book and her own candle, and sat in the chair that had somehow become hers across the hearth from his. And they read whole evenings away in a silence that was not loneliness at all, but its very opposite, the deep companionable quiet of two people who no longer need to fill the air between them because the space is already full. Now and then one of them would read a passage aloud to the other. Now and then they would fall to talking and talk half the night. He learned that she had educated herself, at the counter and after it, out of whatever books she could beg or borrow, and that her mind was quick and hungry and better furnished than that of half the finished young ladies the county had thrown at him over the years. And he took to leaving books where she would find them, the ones he had loved, and watching, with a schoolboy's absurd anxiety, to see whether she would love them too. And there was the matter of the great blue chamber. He had said in the summer that it need not be more than she wished it to be, and he had held to it scrupulously. He had asked nothing, pressed nothing, left the whole question of what their marriage should become entirely in her hands, because he had bound her by circumstance and would not for the world have her feel bound by anything else. It was Rosalind, when the time was right, who drew the last bolt, quietly, without a word made of it. In the way she did most things, and the marriage that had begun as a shield against scandal became, that winter, a marriage in truth, and Adrian, who had thought himself a man carved out of cold stone, discovered in the firelit dark that he was nothing of the kind, and never had been. That the coldness had been only a long holding of the breath, and that he was free at last to let it go. Of what passed between them then the world has no business, and this account keeps none. It is enough to say that the great blue room his mother had chosen, and his grief had frozen, became, at long last, a warm room, and that the chimney, mended by the miller's clever son, drew clean and true, and that no fire in that house ever went out again for want of tending. But there was one bolt he had still not drawn, and it was the deepest of them, and it troubled him in the small hours when Rosalind slept and he lay awake, as was still his habit, watching the fire. He had never told her, in words, that he loved her. He had told her almost everything else. He had told her about his mother and about Cassandra and about the father who walked past his door. He had shown her the estate and the library and the blue chamber and the whole cold architecture of the life she had walked into and warmed. But the three plain words themselves he had not said, though he felt them now in every hour of the day, though they rose in his throat a dozen times and he swallowed them a dozen times, though he knew he was not a stupid man, that she waited for them and would go on waiting, patient as she had promised, on her side of that last door, never knocking, and he did not understand why he could not say them, until one sleepless night that winter he made himself look at it squarely, the way she had taught him to look at hard things, and understood at last that it was the oldest fear of all. That to say the words aloud was to make the loving real and therefore breakable. That so long as he had not quite said it, some cold small coward's corner of him believed he could still survive her loss if it came, as his mother had come and gone in a single week. As Cassandra had smiled and walked away, he was keeping back the words as a man keeps back one coin against ruin, and he despised himself for it, and still he could not spend the coin, and he told himself, as cowards always do, that there was no hurry, that she knew it anyway, that he would say it when the moment was perfect, not seeing in his blindness, that the world was even then preparing a moment that would be very far from perfect, and that his hoarded, unspoken love was a debt that would one day be called in all at once, at the worst possible hour, before the worst possible witnesses. Spring came round again to Wardley, a full year now since the storm, and the park put on the same green it had worn the morning after she came, and Adrian marked the anniversary privately in his own heart and said nothing, for he was not a man who spoke such things aloud, though he was learning. It was in that second spring that two matters arose which, taken together, would light the train that led to the reckoning, the one a joy, the other a shadow, and both of them, as such things often are, tangled up in each other. The joy was that Rosalind was with child. She told him on an April evening in the library, quietly, in her way, watching his face. And Adrian, who had thought himself acquainted with the whole range of his own feelings, and had lately been surprised so often, was surprised most of all by this. For the first thing he felt was not the plain gladness a man is supposed to feel, but a wash of pure cold terror so violent that he had to set down his glass. Terror, he understood a moment later, because now there was one more hostage given to the fate he most feared. One more beloved life to be watched and dreaded for, one more door flung open into a future that could take everything away. He thought at once, helplessly, of his mother, dead of a fever in a week, of how many women he had known of who had not survived their hour. And Rosalind, watching him, read the terror before he could hide it, and did not mistake it for anything but what it was. And she came and knelt by his chair and took his cold hands in her warm ones and said, "I know. I know what you are thinking of, and I will not tell you not to be afraid, for I am a little afraid too, and only a fool would not be. But listen to me, Adrian." She had come that winter, to use his name, and it still went through him each time. "You cannot love anything worth loving without giving a hostage to fortune. There is no safe way to do it. You have spent your whole life trying to find the safe way, and there is not one, and you know it now, and here we are anyway, you and I, out on the open water with no rail to hold to, and I would not go back to the shore for all the world, and I do not believe you would either. We will be afraid, and we will do the thing regardless, 'cause it is worth doing. That is all courage ever is. You taught me that, sitting up all night in a hard chair when you had every reason in the world to be afraid of the scandal and did it anyway. And Adrian, kneeling now himself, with his arms around her and his face in her hair, so that she should not see it, let 1 year's worth and 11 years' worth of held breath go all at once, and if his eyes were wet neither of them ever spoke of it, and it was the nearest he had come, without quite saying the words, to telling her the whole of what was in him. The shadow came 3 days later in the shape of a letter, and it came from Havering, for old Lady Thorncastle of Havering, the very lady to whom Rosalind had been travelling to be a companion on the night the storm and the wrong door changed her life. Was Adrian now learned a cousin of the Ketterings, and Lady Augusta, patient and thorough in her malice, had spent the winter cultivating her. The letter, addressed to Adrian in a spidery old hand, was full of poisoned honey. Lady Thorncastle wrote that she had been most interested indeed, to hear that the young person who had failed to arrive to take up her post had instead become Duchess of Wardley, that she felt it her duty, as one who had very nearly employed the young person and had made, in consequence, certain inquiries into her character before doing so, to acquaint his Grace with what those inquiries had turned up. In case she was sure it was needless, his Grace was not fully apprised of his wife's history, that there was, she was sorry to say, the matter of the milliner's shop, and worse, the matter of some money that had gone missing from that establishment about the time the young person left it, a matter never proved but much spoken of, and that she remained his Grace's most obedient and concerned servant, and had of course mentioned the delicate business to no one but her dear cousins the Ketterings and dear Lady Augusta, who felt, as she did, that his Grace ought to know. Adrian read the letter twice, standing at the study window where he did his hardest thinking, and felt the old cold visor come down and made himself think. The charge about the money was a lie, of that he had no doubt at all. He knew his wife, a woman who would refuse a dukedom barefoot on a cold floor rather than take an unearned advantage, did not steal from a milliner's till, and any fool who had spent an hour in Rosalind's company would know it. But he saw, with a clarity that chilled him, exactly what the letter was for. It was not meant to be believed by him. It was meant to be a weapon put into circulation, a thing that could be whispered, hinted, half retracted, and thereby made unkillable, for a rumour of theft cannot be disproved the way a rumour of misconduct can, since there is never any way to prove that a thing did not happen. Lady Augusta had learned from her first defeat. She could not unmake the marriage with a scandal of the bed, for Adrian had faced that down. So she had gone looking, all winter, for a scandal of the character, for some old dirt to fling at the Duchess that would stick to her past all brushing off, that would sour the county's new-won affection, that would make the name of Wardley a thing whispered over again, until the whole edifice of the young Duchess's hard-won respectability crumbled and Adrian was left with a wife the world would not receive. He did not show Rosalind the letter that day. He told himself it was to spare her, in her condition, needless distress, and there was truth in that. But there was also, buried beneath it, the old coward's instinct, the instinct to close over the wound in silence, to manage the danger alone behind a shut door, to keep even his own wife on the far side of some things. He put the letter in the locked drawer of his desk, and he wrote coldly and carefully to his man of business in London, directing him to establish the exact truth of the missing money at the milliner's, discreetly and thoroughly, and to spare no expense. And he waited and said nothing, and watched the road, for he knew his aunt, and he knew that a letter was never her whole attack but only the softening fire before it, and that she would not be content to poison from a distance. She would come. She would want to be there, to watch, to twist the knife with her own hand and call it kindness. It was only a question of when, and with what confederates, and Adrian meant to be ready. He was not, after all, quite ready in the way he had planned to be, for two things went wrong with his careful cold management of the danger, and both of them were of his own making. The first was that his man of business in London, though diligent, was slow, and the truth about the milliner's money took longer to run to ground than Adrian had reckoned, so that when at last the blow fell, he did not yet have in his hand the proof that would have let him crush the lie outright. He had only his certainty, which is a poor weapon in a drawing-room, where certainties without evidence are merely opinions, and a duke's opinion of his own wife counts, in the world's cruel arithmetic, for less than a stranger's whispered doubt. The second thing that went wrong was worse, and it was the deeper of his two follies. By keeping the letter locked in his desk and saying nothing, he had kept Rosalind of the danger that hung over her, and a danger one does not see coming is a danger one cannot brace for. He had told himself he was protecting her. He had not seen that he was doing to her, in miniature, the very thing his father had done to him, shutting the door, managing the grief alone, leaving the person he loved on the far side of the wall in the name of sparing her. He had spent a year learning to let her in, and now, faced with the first real test since the storm, he had reverted under pressure to the coward's habit of a lifetime, and had locked his wife out of the one room where she most needed to stand beside him. He did not see it. That was the whole trouble. He thought himself very wise and very careful, and he was walking straight into the trap his aunt had set, because the trap was not really laid for Rosalind at all. It was laid for him, for the old cold frightened corner of him that still, after everything, would rather protect than trust, would rather manage than confide, would rather hold back the three plain words than risk the saying of them. Lady Augusta did not know all this in so many words. But she had known Adrian since he was a boy, and she knew, the way a hunter knows the ground, exactly where the cold man's fault line ran, and she had aimed her whole campaign at it. The blow fell on a warm afternoon in the first week of August. A little more than a fortnight before Rosalind's confinement was looked for, when the household was quiet and heavy with summer, and Adrian was going over the hay accounts in the study, still without the London proof. Still with the poisoned letter locked in his drawer, and his wife in ignorance of it in the garden below his window, cutting roses, her hand resting now and then on the swell beneath her gown in the unconscious way of a woman near her time. He watched her from the window for a moment, and his heart turned over with a tenderness so fierce it frightened him, and he thought, he actually let himself think, God forgive him, that perhaps the danger had passed off, that his aunt had thought better of it, that the letter had been an idle spite, and no more would come of it. That he might, after all, keep his happiness behind the safe shut door of his own management, and never have risked the open water Rosalind had spoken of. It was at that precise moment, as though the fates had waited for the arrogance of it, that he heard the wheels upon the gravel. He knew the sound before he saw the carriage. He had been listening for it, at some level, for 4 months. He set down his pen and rose and went to the window, and the old cold visor came down over his face like portcullis. And below him on the sweep of the drive an unwelcome and familiar carriage was drawing up before his door, its horses steaming in the heat, and he watched the footman let down the step, and he watched the passengers descend, and he counted them, and the counting told him the whole battle order of the thing before a word was spoken. There were 3, and Adrian, standing very still at his study window with his wife's laughter drifting up faint from the rose garden below, understood that the reckoning he had half let himself hope was past had merely been taking its time, and had now, in its own chosen hour and on its own chosen ground, arrived, and that he had not, for all his cold careful management, made himself ready for it at all, and that the price of that would very shortly be asked of him in full, before witnesses, with everything he loved upon the table. He drew a long breath. Down in the garden Rosalind had heard the wheels too. He saw her straighten a rose in her hand and turn toward the house, and lift her head in that way she had, unafraid, ready to meet whatever came, with her chin up and her honesty for armor, not knowing, as he knew and had not told her, exactly how sharp a thing was coming, nor that he had left her to walk toward it undefended. And Adrian, watching her, felt the shame of that at last, fully and finally, and knew that whatever else this day cost him, the reckoning had come first of all for the coward in himself, and that the only way out of it now led straight through the thing he had spent his whole life avoiding, standing up in the open before them all and telling the truth of his own heart out loud, with no wall left to hide behind. He went down to meet them. In the carriage were 3, as he had known there would be, Lady Augusta Vane, and Miss Sophronia Kettering, and Miss Kettering's mother, and they came in upon a wave of summer civility, all warmth and neighbourliness. Lady Augusta swept into the hall as though she had never left it under a cloud, embracing the air beside Rosalind's cheek. exclaiming over the Duchess's condition with a tenderness that would have deceived anyone who did not know her. She had come, she said, on a visit of a few days, to see how dear Adrian and his bride were settling before the happy event, and to bring, she added. And Adrian saw the glitter come up behind her eyes like a fish rising, some little news that touched them both nearly, and that she felt as family. It was her painful duty not to keep back. She'd not fire the shot at once. She was too good a general for that. She let the afternoon and the dinner run their course. She admired the roses Rosalind had cut, and praised the improvements to the mill, and was gracious to the servants, and drew Rosalind out, gently, about her hopes for the coming child, so that the whole table was lulled and warm and off its guard. And then, over the fruit, with the candles lit and the servants withdrawn to the sideboard, she laid the coal upon the straw. It concerned, she was so grieved to say, a matter that had come to her through her dear cousin Lady Thorncastle of Havering, the very lady, how strange the world was, whom the dear Duchess had so nearly served. It seemed there had been, at the milliner's establishment where the Duchess had once been employed, Lady Augusta was sure everyone knew of that now. There was no shame in honest work, none in the world, a sum of money that had gone missing about the time the young person left, a considerable sum. Never proved against anyone, of course, these things so seldom were, but much spoken of at the time, and the suspicion had fallen, most unfairly no doubt, upon the young woman who had had the keeping of the till and who had, so conveniently, departed just then to better herself. Lady Augusta was certain, quite certain, that it was all a wicked misunderstanding. But the county, she was sorry to say, was beginning to hear of it, and a rumour of that particular kind was so very hard to lay, touching as it did not merely a lady's birth, which one might forgive, but her honesty, which one could not, and she had thought, in all affection, that dear Adrian ought to be told, so that he might consider. The words fell soft as ash into the silence. What was best to be done, before the child came and the name of Wardley was fixed to it forever? The trap was perfect, and Adrian, sitting rigid at the head of his own table, saw every tooth of it at once. For if he defended his wife with mere passion, mere assertion, he would look exactly like a besotted man refusing to see the truth, and the rumour would live. If he showed the smallest doubt, the marriage was as good as dead. And worst of all, this was the cruelty of the timing, and he understood that his aunt had chosen it with care. Rosalind was a fortnight from her confinement, white now and trembling under the assault, and any violent scene, any collapse, any shock, might do her and the child a harm past mending. His aunt had aimed the blow to fall where he could neither parry it with rage nor absorb it in silence, and where the very act of fighting might injure the thing he fought for. It was the finest, coldest piece of malice he had ever seen, and he had seen a great deal. And into the clenched place in his chest the old black flood began to rise, the whole 11 years of it, the door, the light, the loss, the knife handed to the world. He had let himself love, and here was the fate he had always known would come of it, standing at his own table dressed as his aunt, asking to take everything away. He looked at Rosalind, white and shaking, one hand pressed to the swell beneath her gown, and the coward in him, the corner that had kept the letter locked in the drawer, and the 3 words locked in his throat, whispered that he should have listened to himself all along, that this was what came of opening doors. But Rosalind looked back at him. She looked at him down the length of the table, past the candles, straight into his eyes, and he saw that she was afraid, mortally afraid for herself and the child, and above all, he understood, for him, for what this might do to the fragile, warm thing they had built. But that under the fear was the same clean, unbreakable honesty that had made her refuse a dukedom barefoot on his cold floor 2 winters gone, and he saw something else in her face too, something that struck him harder than any accusation of his aunt's. He saw that she did not know. She did not know about the letter he had locked in his drawer 4 months ago, nor about the inquiry he had set on foot. She was meeting this ambush wholly unprepared, undefended, blindsided, because he had not told her. Because he had shut the door and managed the danger alone, in the name of sparing her, exactly as his father had shut the door on a stunned boy of 9. And the shame of that went through him like a cold blade and, strangely, burned the coward's flood right out of him. For there is a shame that unmans a man, and a shame that makes him at last a man, and this was the second kind. He rose. "Aunt," he said, and his voice was very quiet, and something in the quiet of it made even Lady Augusta's practiced smile falter. You have gone to a great deal of trouble. A letter to me in April, which I have kept. A winter spent cultivating Lady Thorncastle. A journey here in the heat at the 1 hour you judged my wife least able to bear it. I have watched the whole of it come on, these 4 months, and I have made ready for it, and I am ashamed to say I made ready for it in the wrong way, quietly, alone, behind a locked drawer. Keeping it even from her, as though she were a thing to be protected and not a woman to be trusted, and for that Rosalind hinted to his wife before them all, and did not lower his voice, for that I ask your pardon here, where I did the wrong of it. I should have told you in April. I should never have left you to walk into this room today undefended. I have spent my whole life learning to manage danger alone behind shut doors, and it is the worst habit I have, and it very nearly cost us everything just now, and I am done with it. That is said. And he turned back to the table, and reached into the breast of his coat, and drew out a folded paper, for the answer he had waited on all summer had come at last, 2 days since, and he had been carrying it against his heart without yet knowing what he meant to do with it, and now he knew. This, said Adrian, unfolding the paper, is a letter from my man of business in London, who has spent the summer, at my direction and no small expense, establishing the exact truth of the money that went missing from Madame Revox's millinery 2 winters ago. The money my aunt would have you all believe my wife took. It is a thorough letter. He is a thorough man. He found Madame Revox herself, who is living yet, and he found her books, and he found the girl who took the money, which was a niece of Madame's own, one Thérèse, who confessed the whole of it at the time and was sent quietly back to France to spare the family the shame, 3 full weeks before Miss Merrow ever left the shop, so that the very dates my aunt's rumour depends upon are a lie, and can be shown to be a lie, in Madame Revox's own signed hand, which I hold here. My wife was never so much as suspected by the one person who had the right to suspect anyone. The suspicion my aunt speaks of never existed until my aunt required it to, this last winter, and put it about herself. I have the proof of that here as well, for Lady Thorncastle, God help her, keeps her letters, and one of them, procured from her household at some cost, sets out in my aunt's own hand the favour she was asking and the reason for it. The silence in the room had changed its quality entirely. It was no longer the appalled silence of a table watching a woman shamed. It was the far colder silence of a table watching a schemer caught. Miss Kettering had gone the colour of ash and was staring at her plate. Her mother had begun very slightly to edge her chair back from Lady Augusta's, in the immemorial way of an ally deciding she was never truly an ally at all. And Lady Augusta Vane, for the first time in Adrian's memory, had nothing whatever to say. You came into my house, Adrian went on, and now at last he let some of the heat show through the cold, to poison the one clean thing in my life, at the hour you thought would do the most harm to a woman carrying my child. You did it because 2 years ago you were balked of selling me to Miss Kettering here, whom I do not blame, for she was a pawn in it as much as anyone, and to whom I am sorry for the wasted journey and the wasted hopes. You have failed. You have failed completely, and you have exposed yourself in the failing, and I will tell you what is to come of it. You will leave this house within the hour, not the morning, the hour. You will never enter it again while I live. And if I ever learn that you have breathed further syllable against my wife, in this county or in London or in any drawing-room on the earth, I will publish this letter, all of it, your hand and Lady Thorncastle's together. And I will let the world see precisely what Lady Augusta Vane does with her affections and her leisure, and you will find that a woman of 64 with a ruined reputation is a very much colder thing to be than a duke with a piquant story. Do we understand each other, aunt? I believe we do. Nod if you would, so that the servants may see you have understood, for they will bear witness to it, every man and maid of them, and they love their duchess, which is more than any soul at this table, but I can say. Lady Augusta nodded. It was a very small nod, and it cost her, one could see, more than money, and then she rose, gathering the shreds of her consequence about her like a wet cloak, and went out, and the Ketterings went with her, and the great door of Wardley Court closed upon the 3 of them within the hour as Adrian had promised, and did not open to them again. But Adrian did not watch them go. He had already forgotten them. For the moment the thing was decided, he had crossed the room to his wife, who had risen from her chair and was standing with one hand gripping its back and the other pressed hard to her side, and whose face had gone from white to grey. And he reached her just as her knees gave and caught her, as no one had ever caught the boy of 9, as he had sworn in his heart his own children would always be caught, and lifted her clean up into his arms. And it was in that moment, feeling her cling to him and gasp against his shoulder, that he understood the shock and the strain had brought her hour on early. The next hours were the longest of his life, and he spent none of them behind a shut door. He carried her up himself to the great blue chamber his mother had chosen and his grief had frozen and his wife had thawed, and he sent the fastest horse in his stable for the doctor and the second fastest for the midwife, and then, where once he would have been banished, or would have banished himself, to pace some cold library alone with his dread, managing his terror in solitude as he managed everything, he did not go. Rosalind, between the panes, gripped his hand and asked him to stay. And he stayed. He stayed through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her brow, saying her name, being told sharply by the midwife that this was no place for a gentleman, and answering that he was not a gentleman here, he was her husband and would remain. And he learned, in that long night, more of courage from watching his wife than he had learned in 33 years of being called by fools a hard man. And near dawn, with the first grey light coming up behind the shutters exactly as it had on morning she woke in his bed 2 winters gone, the child was born. A daughter, sound and whole and furious, and Rosalind, spent and shining and alive, laid the small red creature in the crook of her arm and looked up at Adrian, and Adrian Thorne, Duke of Wardley, who had not wept since he was 9 years old, put his face down against his wife's damp hair and wept at last, wholly and without shame, all the frozen grief of a lifetime melting out of him at once. And he said into her hair the thing he had hoarded like a last coin against ruin for a year and more. The 3 plain words he had swallowed 1,000 times, and he found they cost him nothing at all now, nothing, that they were the easiest words he had ever spoken, and he could not think why he had ever feared them. I love you, Rosalind. I have loved you, so I spread your cloak over your cold arm and did not know what it was. I should have said it 100 times over, and I was a coward and I hoarded it, and I will spend the rest of my life saying it instead, twice a day, until you are sick of the sound of it. I love you. There. The last door is open. There is not a bolted room left in me that is not yours, nor ever will be again. And Rosalind, too tired to say much and not needing to, only turned her cheek against his and smiled, and said that she had always known it, from the cloak, from the very first, that a cold man does not warm a stranger's wrist, and that she had only been waiting, patient on her side of the door, for him to find the courage to say what she had read in him that first grey morning, and that it had been worth the wait, every hour of it, and here was their daughter to prove it. And would he look, only look at how cross she was? They named the child for his mother, so that the name should be a warmth in the house at last and not a wound, and they lived a long time and well. The county, which is a shrewd judge in the end, and had always half distrusted Lady Augusta Vane, drew its own conclusions from her sudden banishment, and took the young Duchess the more firmly to its heart for it, and the story that travelled in the end was not the poisoned one at all, but the true one, that the cold Duke of Wardley, who had frozen off every matchmaker in 3 counties, had lost his heart so wholly to a portionless girl stranded at his door in a storm that he had faced down his own family at his own table to defend her, and had married her for love and no other reason on the earth. The county forgave the Wardleys everything and adored them for it, for the world loves a hard man melted better than it loves almost anything, and the milliner's counter in the retelling became first a genteel misfortune bravely borne, and at last, among the kinder tellers, a positive romance. There were more children in the house in time, and they grew up unafraid, walked past by no one, caught every time they fell, and the long gallery that had once frightened a lonely boy of 9 rang with running feet that had never known what it was to be cold in that house, because their mother had come in out of a storm and warmed the whole of it, hearth by hearth, from the edges inward, until there was no frost left in it anywhere. And on winter nights, when the wind got up and threw the rain against the leads the way it had on the night she came, Adrian Thorne, Duke of Wardley, would sometimes take his wife's hand by the fire and say, in the dry voice she had taught him at last to laugh with, that he owed the whole of his happiness to a chimney that would not draw and a housemaid who could not tell one blue room from another. And Rosalind would say that she owed hers, rather, to a man who, finding a tired stranger asleep by mistake in his own bed, had sat up the whole of a cold night in a hard chair to keep her safe and never once let her feel afraid, and who had never, whatever he pretended to the world, been half so cold as he wished to be thought. And they were both of them right, and neither of them, from that grey morning to the last, was ever alone again.